Thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your framing of it. It does have spiritual dimension, where our minds, our hearts, and our souls are connected as we engage in the process of making music and even listening to it. So when you're, in a space where music is being played for an audience, there's a kind of a dialectical relationship between the audience and the performers where they feed on each other. And so that's a beautiful. I'm glad you played. I was disappointed to hear that you no longer played. I was very happy to hear that one of your favorites is Clifford Brown, because he's one of my favorites, as he is for most jazz trumpeters, because he's one of the icons. But yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me specifically of one story. I'm just a kid at this point, a ninth grader or something, and I played a set with a jazz combo that I was performing with, and he walks up to me after, and this guy's in tears, basically, and like telling me that like my performance like changed him, and like for me, it was hard to understand, right? I'm just a kid, I'm still learning this stuff, but like I felt it, right? When I was performing, and everything. So it just really opened my eyes to the fact that there's so much that we still have yet to discover, but we can still explore these kind of unnamed sometimes or, mysterious connections that we have between each other, because human connectivity, I think, is a place where you can where we can really like develop our collective consciousness and our collective understanding of the universe. So I just appreciate that you narrowed in on that.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, because in this very conversation, through conversation, because jazz improvisation is very conversational. The call and response dynamic, uh, and the way you're putting it. See, you played, and so you had the experience of extending your own voice and personality through an instrument. That's, in some circles, that's called self as instrument, right? And as a ninth grader, I mean, in ninth grade, what are you, 15,
14.
14?
Yeah.
And to have someone say you changed them, which means that you touch them deeply, and that's what music does. But that's what conversation can do also. I think a commonality between these two practices, conversation, dialogue, dialogos, and playing music, is how it reflects and captures our emotions, our feeling self, right? And so in conversation, if we both come in good faith as we are, and we get into this conversational flow, other people viewing it can see it. They could feel it. And that has the potential to actually change things. People think, it's just talking. Well, it can be deeper than that, and the commonality is flow. You can get into a flow state as you do your own work. You can get into a flow state in conversation, and you can get into a flow state as you play and perform music, and jazz in particular, because there's that element of the new that comes up. If you're not just reading what's written on the script, which is beautiful, I'm talking about like the European classical and chamber tradition, but you're playing where you have a particular song. In this case, you have certain chord changes and forms of the song that you're playing, but there's a sense of novelty and discovery as you pursue improvising, creating your own aesthetic statement on the melody, the harmony, the theme, the mood, all of that with other people. There's a magic to that. So I appreciate you starting there. We're going to be talking about some subjects that don't readily give themselves to that type of level of interaction. Hopefully, we will be able to do that in our talk about race and deracialization too.
A lot of the media that I was seeing out there that was being put out there about conversations on race, I felt like they weren't really touching on the vast universe that encompasses that subject matter. And so I think some of the most pivotal points were being left out. And so I wanted to make sure that I created a space where we could get some of those points out. And I think I've successfully done that so far. But, as I've been doing it, really the next stage that I see for myself and for the show is basically what you were just talking about, which is I want to be able to display these communications on race to an audience who can then have that same kind of experience that I gave that guy during our
Right.
performance, right? So that we can get them in that flow state so they have an opportunity to get there, right? Because a lot of people, they don't even have the chance to experience that. Same with people who don't play an instrument, right? Like if you're in an audience where people are playing, you can get there, right? You can
Right.
experience that on the back end. But if you never go to a concert, if you never pick up an instrument, if you never listen to a jazz record, right? Like then it's going to be something that's outside of your purview. And I think in the race context, there's a lot of people in that space, and I just want to bring more people into the fold, so that people can make educated, informed decisions about themselves, about the world around them as it relates to our racial dynamics. I don't think that people have even been given a chance at doing that for the most part because there's a lot of widespread ignorance on the subject of race.
Yes, you're right. There's a lot of independent study that has to be done. I mean, I'm someone that has dealt with and studied race since I was in college from 1981 to 1985. Uh, and I went to graduate school from 1996 to 1999, American Studies at NYU, delving even deeper. But so much of it has been independent study. So there's a process of education that people need so they can understand these dynamics, not simply from the left progressive, right conservative perspective. That's one that is framed pretty readily, at least in the media, both mainstream and social. But from a deeper levels of perspectives. I mean, anyone's been hearing us speak in this first 10 to 15 minutes of this conversation, they should be able to tell that beyond the similarities in our skin tone, that we are thoughtful individuals who have a range of perspectives of depth just in this short time. So hopefully they'll also realize that that is true regarding race. But the problem is, well, safety. If you look at Maslow's hierarchy, those 7 levels, the first 3 have to do with safety and security, right? So people, because they don't know, that's the ignorance piece, because they haven't necessarily done the study, and I'm talking about people in general, they feel unsure about speaking, particularly in an environment post 2020. I mean, it's been the case a long time that, they probably should have added race to where they used to say, never talk about, at the dinner table, money or
Politics,
religion.
religion,
They
yeah.
probably should have added race to that. But that safety piece can be opened up, one, if you're coming in good faith, if you kind of own up in the beginning that there's a lot that you probably have to learn, but yet you're open and you have certain questions, you don't understand certain things. And I think there has to be a level of grace and empathy that we have for where people are, because the truth of the matter is we have all, in the United States and elsewhere, but my focus is here in the United States, we've been racialized. Race has been imposed on us. And that being the case, it's the social norm. It's the social norm in our language. It's the social norm in how it's discussed on TV and online. It's the social norm in documents that we have to fill out where they don't give you a choice. They just ask you, what race are you? Which assumes that race is a reality. And it compels you to racialize yourself. So we can't blame people for having a conception of themselves in racial terms. What we can try to do is present perspectives that can educate people and give them an understanding of certain aspects of racial dynamics historically, how one can get from underneath the racial box or the racial uh, foothold, or the shoe of race. I'm just coming up with some metaphors on the spot. There are ways to get from under it, but it's not easy. So we have to give people a chance to feel safe enough to ask certain questions, to engage in conversations, and even to the point of like, there's going to be certain stereotypes because we've inherited that. That's a whole part of the racialization process, stereotyping. So, and this is something that you don't see, particularly from the political spectrum. This is the problem. One of the problems of just looking at it through a political lens. If we look at it through individual and interpersonal lens, and we look at it through a cultural lens in terms of values and meanings and how we can adapt and adopt certain aspects of an identity, personal and group, that are not based on race, we can start to find out our way out of this racialized paradigm, this racialized worldview and racial worldview that we've been in. But it's not easy. That's why it takes what they call in Buddhism skillful means. You know what I mean? You have to be able to listen deeply. That we call that big ears at Jazz Leadership Project. You have to be able to listen with your head, your heart, and your gut, those three brains. And you've got to be patient with people, and you've got to build your own knowledge base so that you actually have something to say on the topic. You know what I'm saying? All of which is a tall order. And some people, people are trying to live their lives. You know what I mean? And it's like there's certain struggles and battles that people will wage. There's certain issues of concern to them. It so happens that racialization and deracialization happens to be a strong concern of mine, because I am very clear that in the United States, this is one of the fundamental issues and problems that we've had and continue to have. And that unless we deal with this topic, there's a lot of problems, a lot of predicaments, of course. But this particular problem, unless we come to some deeper, better understanding of how to resolve it, as we called it on September 24th in Lexington, Massachusetts, my colleagues, Carlos Hoyt and Sheena Mason, they're both doctors, Dr. Hoyt and Dr. Mason. We had a conference called Resolving the Racism Dilemma. And until we can come to some type of resolution, at least among a critical mass of us, a tipping point of us, who will, in my view, and in theirs and others, who are part of this small group of people who are adopting what we call a non-racial worldview, is to stop, as you alluded to earlier, racializing ourselves and racializing others. It's actually a choice, but people don't know it's a choice. So we have to take the time to explain it and let them know that you don't have to agree with it. You don't have to keep, you may have been given or ascribed a racial identity, but as I said in a correspondence in response to Glenn Lowry as a part of what he called a deracialization symposium, we don't have to keep subscribing to it. I think we can cut the cord. Like, you cut the cord with the cable companies where it's like, you must have a phone, cable, and wireless with us. And then other services developed that allowed you to cut the cord so that you could just have Wi-Fi if you want. You could have internet and Wi-Fi. You didn't have to have a landline also. Same thing can happen with race and racialization, I think.
I'm definitely very skeptical about that, and we'll get into my skepticism about it, and I'll talk about it. But I want to read a comment we have in the chat here first and get your response.
There will be a select relative few who can still, balance the type of critical and cognitive thoughtfulness, reflection, study, that is required for what you're talking about. But that's a rarity. So no, you're right. It's not impossible. I didn't mean to imply it is or was.
Well, the reason why I bring up that it's not impossible, I just want to be clear about this, is because what we need to understand is that the direction that you want people to go is something that
Yes.
there is a force, a powerful force working against,
Yes.
making sure that that happens. And
I would say forces.
yes, I would agree with that. I just I try not to get like, it may seem a little bit Star Trekky, or fantasy to
or or
people.
or or, or yeah, I know what you mean. The force. Yeah.
Exactly, Star Wars, right? Yeah, yeah. I feel like, I don't want to get into the kind of fantastical realm, where people are thinking. I've been accused of this before, of people being like, "Oh, what are you talking about? Like spirits and sprites and elves or something?" And I'm like, "No, no, 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 no. These are like real things. They're just nebulous, right? They're hard to characterize and quantify for people." And so,
Well, in the
despite
Bible, they called it principalities and powers.
that's a good way of putting it, right? Principalities and powers is a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Especially in a situation where we've had a racial hierarchy, a tyrannical racial hierarchy imposed on us. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
One that's been supported by our government for generations.
Oh, no
So,
question. Oh, there's no question. I mean, that's just historical fact.
yeah, well, I mean, you say no question, it's historical fact, but in fact, on social media, I'm constantly arguing about these points. And there are people who believe, like, if you go on my YouTube channel of the same name, the Contraband Wagon, you'll see a very short clip of me having one of these conversations with a racialized white man. Again, this is just a random person from Twitter who, like, signed up, and the reason why he came on the show was because I was like, we live in a white supremacist society. I think that that is a reasonable thing to say. And he thought it was completely unreasonable that I would say that. And so I brought him on the show and I was like, well, let me ask you something. Do you think that this country has a long storied history of white supremacy, in all of its institutions? And he was like, absolutely, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, when do you think that ended? Like when was white supremacy over? When did we make the cut? And
Break.
he just sat there for 20 seconds thinking, and I'm like, so you're so dead set on believing that we're past white supremacy, that we no longer live in a white supremacist nation, but you can't identify when it happened, when the transition from then to now happened. And of course, a lot of people try to identify the Civil Rights Act as being the moment where it happened. However, on our show, we've also talked to many people who were alive at that time, racialized white people living in black neighborhoods, black people who were alive at the time experiencing the death of Martin Luther King and the passage of the act. And it just goes to show, from hearing their stories, their life experiences, and of course my own parents who were growing up at that time, that racism was alive and well after that, and it continues to be alive and well. We see in 2023, in reflected in police brutality, in educational outcomes and experiences that children are having, and so we still got a lot of work to do. But I always tell people, I'm a mathematics instructor, and we teach problem solving in mathematics, right? Because that's a huge part of doing math. And one thing that you'll learn if you do problem solving work is that the first step to solving any problem is identifying the problem. You have to identify it. If you can't identify it, the chances that you will solve it are virtually nil. Okay, and so we are still at the identification stage, in my estimation, on the problem of race. A lot of people do not understand how all encompassing it is. They don't understand the consequences of the imposition of the racial hierarchy. And those consequences are so widespread and extensive that that's why people are like, oh, you think everything's about race, everything, you're always connecting stuff to race. It's like, because that is the consequence of what was done, not because we have some kind of internal desire to hold on to race. You and I, if anything, are the exact opposite of that. And so I think that there's just so many paradoxes and contradictions in educating yourself about this subject and learning about it and understanding it. And that's why we're still at the identification stage, because a lot of people don't know how to, solve those seeming contradictions that are really just paradoxes that you have to understand and internalize before you can move on to the next stage, you know?
I don't lean on white supremacy because, first of all, I don't believe it. I don't believe it's true. It's folklore. It's based on what Albert Murray, the folklore of white supremacy.
Well, that's what I mean when I say white supremacy.
Which is connected to the fake lore of Black pathology. So in other words, it is a folklore. But man, we're not folk people. We're modern and postmodern, right? So I don't want to keep holding on to a folk belief that I don't believe is true, that isn't true. You know what I'm saying? And I don't want to keep empowering that. I mean, when you talk about actual...
Wait, Greg. We got to pause right there for a second.
Let's do it.
Empowering white supremacy. So I think we need to be clear, right? Like, white supremacy doesn't need you or I to empower it. It does not. Okay? I completely agree with you in terms of your I guess, like, description of it, right? Like, it's not real. Of course, no, I don't believe in it. However, it is, it's very much like race in that regard, right? Like, I don't believe in the idea of races, right? Like, and, I don't ascribe to it. My identity is not a racial identity, at least the way that I see myself. Right. However, I have a show about race, right? Like, despite all of that, right? And the reason why is because the consequences of the power that it has been given, despite it not being real, is what I'm fighting against, right? I'm fighting against the racism element that, invigorated the categories of race. Similarly, in white supremacy, the folklore, the false folklore, the mythology of, the idea that white people are somehow superior because of their skin color, black people are somehow inferior because of their skin color, because of their skull size, because of their facial features, because of their geographic origin, that they are genetically, intellectually inferior, that that black people are genetically, what's the word?
Like biological essentialism or something?
Yeah, exactly. That we're good at sports, right? That, like, we're not smart, but we're excellent at sports.
Yeah. If it's physical,
physicality, yeah.
But exactly. if it's mental,
exactly, precisely. So all these things, right, that have kind of been passed down from generation to generation, and people do believe it. I just watched a YouTube clip of a teacher a white teacher telling a classroom of black students that he thought white people were superior, and he didn't think that anything was wrong with that. And you could see the crestfallen faces of the students realizing that he was being honest, and that they had no idea of that and what that might mean for them.
But we know there's no question that's horrible, but that's not that widespread. That is a very...
I completely disagree.
You think that there are actually, in classrooms around this nation, where there are people who are racialized as white, who are telling students
not in their classroom, students, but who hold the belief that white people are superior. And yes, I do believe that. Correct. Yeah, I've been a teacher for a couple decades now. Most teachers are racialized white. 4 out of every 5 are racialized white. So in public education, and so. Yeah, I do believe my experience from the background and as a student tells me that there's a substantial number of teachers who hold those beliefs. Not that they communicate it to students,
right.
But that they hold them, yes. And so, like, I don't distinguish between people who will vocalize them and not. Actually, this teacher who did it, he was very nice about it. Like, he was very polite.
He just stated it as this is the way it is.
He was like, I think that anyone would think the same thing, So in his mind, he's thinking a very common belief. And so, like, we have to be careful about talking about what's rare, what's not rare, what's this and that. A lot of people hide their beliefs in the race context because they're ashamed of their own selves.
If we're going to talk about something, let's speak about it with a certain precision. You understand my use of terms like racialized as, black or white identified, nominally. You understand that. You have studied this stuff to know that what I am doing by doing that is not imposing a belief in race upon the way I speak about other human beings. But I'm at the same time acknowledging how and the fact that they have been racialized. So the reason I'm disappointed in scholars within these fields I'm talking about is that they never adopted the expression folklore of white supremacy. Call it what it is. So if you said to me, the folklore of white supremacy is still, that gives me less to argue with. You know what
I
I'm
guess,
saying?
like, I mean, to me, it's like I get what you're saying, Greg, but like for me, like white supremacy is folklore. So like that's like the definition of it. So like for me, like I'm
Okay.
like yeah. So like for me, I didn't think of making a distinction like
Okay.
that. But
Okay.
where you say racialized as, that's something that I did adopt from Dr. Mason actually. So Dr. Mason
Hey.
came on the show. She explained, and I
Yes.
think Angel Eduardo as well, and I talked about this because she had
Who's
talked to
this?
Dr. Mason. Angel Eduardo, he's a senior writer and editor at
Oh, yes.
Fire right now. But yeah, we all talked about the fact that by saying racialized as black, by identifying myself as that, what I'm doing is I'm telling people I know that the only reason people are calling me black is because of this hierarchy that was imposed on us generations ago that has carried through the ages, but that I'm also distinguishing myself as someone who understands that that imposition was put on me and that I did not adopt it, and
Right.
somehow make it a part of myself. So,
What I am proposing, sir, is that we adopt an explicit use of folklore of white supremacy because people don't know. Some people know, but a lot of people don't know. So when people hear white supremacy, you got generations like, who are like, white supremacy. Okay, I think I understand what that is. Um, how does it apply? Where do you find it? You know what I mean? It seems kind of amorphous. And I'm not saying that not only has it been, was it a reality, particularly before the civil rights movement, so explicitly. I mean, you had racial codes, and people who were racialized as black had to freaking drink at different fountains. Come on, white. I mean, so to that person that you were talking about, show them a picture of that. You said the person who was saying, well, show them a picture
well,
of
I mean,
that.
he knows that he knew about that, I mean, and we're talking about my parents, right? Like my dad who swam in a black
Right,
only pool, right? So
right.
like,
My parents too,
yeah.
in that generation when that was still exactly. So, but my point is that let us adopt, and I really haven't like made a case for this, and I really appreciate the opportunity and platform to do so. I think we need to adopt folklore of white supremacy from the work of Albert Murray so that we can make it clear to folks that we realize that that crap is a myth.
I find that the fixation on the language that we use is often not just cabined in terms of like better communication as you're suggesting here. I think oftentimes it's characterized as a prescription for dealing with for like eliminating race, and I don't think that that follows. I do think that it's a necessary element, right? In order for us to get to a place where we can shed these racial categorizations and the stereotypes that have been with us since the founding of the country, I think that ultimately we do need to communicate more and more efficiently and effectively on this subject matter. So, in that regard, I see it. But in terms of like us making that change, like racialized as or folklore of white supremacy, as in terms of that putting us on a trajectory to eliminate racial categories, I don't see that being a big watershed moment in the timeline, I guess you could say. And so, um, I'm very
Can I
much a
respond?
math.
Can I respond to that, or
Oh,
do
of
you have?
course. Go ahead.
Do
Go
you
ahead.
want to but do you want to spell it out even more?
No, that's fine. I think you got me. So go for it.
Okay, cool. So, many thoughts come to mind. Um, hmm. Well, I'll approach it like this. When I was on with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter at the end of December.
Deracialization, I assume. Yes, we watched it
Yes,
right here
talking
live
about
on the stream.
deracialization. What's that?
We watched you live here on the stream. I gave my
Oh,
commentary. Yeah.
oh, great. Thank you. One of the things I kept saying is, we need to scaffold this. We can't just do this overnight. It's not going to happen like that. It's too embedded. It's too entrenched. So we have to scaffold it. So one thing I would say is that this is a part of the scaffolding. It's not a be all and end all. Just changing your language games is not going to be a panacea. No, but it's a part of the process because we actually, obviously,
So
we
we actually
communicate.
fully agree on that then.
It's like this. No. But check this out. Now let's talk about again levels in terms of ontological reality. There's various levels of what we call reality, right? There's a reality from a first person perspective, my subjective experience and my subjective perspective. There's a third person perspective, objective, that's dealing with structures and systems and legal systems, and that's another. And then you have the second person, which is more of the interpersonal, intersubjective we space, as it's called in integral theory, and I'm a student of integral theory. So when we look at reality through those three lenses, the question becomes, how do we deracialize through those three lenses? Can I, as an individual person, stop racializing myself? The answer is yes, because I've stopped. As I engage with you, Will, and others, do I have to stop? Can I stop racializing you? Will is a Black man. I can stop doing that. I can stop viewing you through a racial lens. Now, the third person, the objective realm, that's the tough one.
I mean, to me, that is the realm that we need to fix. Like the rest of it
Right.
is.
Well, I would say I
Yeah.
don't think it's either or. Now, it may be the primary one to focus on because that's what keeps the categories so firmly in place. And we also have to add media to that, because media is a part of that third person. It's a window through which we see certain aspects of reality. But that's why in my piece, it was originally titled Considering Deracialization, and it was first published at the Developmentalist website, which is the website for the Institute for Cultural Evolution, where I'm a senior fellow. But then online at the platform Free Black Thought, it was called Deracialization Now. We talked about, and this came through Carlos Hoy, we introduced this at that Resolving the Racism Dilemma conference on September 24th of last year that I mentioned, where we used the census as a fulcrum to start making some of these changes that we're talking about in this systemic third person objective realm. So what's the proposal is that instead of compelling people to racialize themselves by just saying, what race are you? And you've got these like 8 or 9 categories, which in and of themselves are just kind of absurd because, and it keeps changing. You know what I mean?
Well, they have no choice. They
Every
have to
10
keep up
years.
with actual reality, right? I'll get into.
Huh?
They have to keep up with actual reality, right? So, like, one thing that I want to, I'm going to let you go on, but just I want to
Sure.
come back at some point to
Yeah.
the idea of. Well, we'll get there. I'm just going to let you go.
No, I don't want you to lose the thought. Let me at least write down what you're talking about, the subject that you're talking about.
Keep going. It'll come back. It'll come back.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So, go on.
So the proposal, and this is actually being proposed to the U.S. Census because for the first time, I think this was last year, 2022, they asked for public comment. And so Carlos And we supported it, and we had a online survey where people could support it. Said, let's take the following steps. In addition to having that, we're not saying eliminate that question. So if people still want to accept being racialized, they have this option. We are not totalitarians or authoritarians. I believe, and my colleagues believe, that people should have choices. So if they want to continue filling it out the way they have been, okay. If they want to identify the fact that they don't even believe in race at all, they should be able to do that. And then finally, if they want to indicate how they've been ascribed a racial identity, they can say that they have been racialized as, and fill in the blank. And that way, some of the stats that they collect to determine bias and discrimination and gaps, and you can continue doing that under the rubric of, well, people who are racialized as have these experiences. We could find out how many people don't even believe that race is real. Then you have an indication. You might be surprised. And I would suspect that over time, as this deracialization or anti-racialization, as Carlos Hoyt calls it, or racelessness, as Sheena Mason calls it, builds up and more people become aware of it, you might have more and more people who would say, I don't even believe in that at all. So at least give people the choice. So that would be one way of cracking that nut at that level. But I am not going to downplay the end of, that's why I started by saying the ontological reality. It's reality at different levels. You do have a subjective experience. We're both experiencing the world through the lens of this body, these eyes, this brain. That's subjective. But we know that the systemic and the structural is also real. And so is this interpersonal interaction that we're having right now. So all of them are important. And I think we have to really fight on all fronts simultaneously. Some say, oh, just the personal, just the individual. No. Or just the structural, the systemic. Nah. I think on all fronts we need to confront it.
I really don't know how useful it is to partition reality like that, or to think of reality as being partitioned that way.
Interesting.
I think instead of saying reality is partition, I think it's more like our perspectives, right, on reality are not necessarily within the same universe, right? Like my experience as Will as Contraband, going through my life in this body, like you said, with this brain, in this mind, with my experiences. I'll give you an example, right? Like, in our audience, an example. So I have the experience as this person in this body of a lot of people telling me that I made them think about something that they never thought about before. That is a very common thing that people say to me on a regular basis throughout the course of my life since I was very young.
Wow.
And so nobody would know that about me, right? Like that is something that is within my own experience that nobody else would know. Every individual person who tells me this, they don't know that I've experienced that throughout the course of my life, right? When they're saying it to me. It's something that I share with people. When they say it to me, I'm like, yeah, this is something that I hear all the time, and does me sharing that, the reason why I share it with people is because I want to give them insight into what it's like to be me, right? Because otherwise they're never going to get that. Okay. Right. And so like, I get what you're saying in terms of like, there are these partitions, right? We're experiencing the universe and the world differently depending upon what lens we're looking through. And I like that you use the word lens, but that's exactly what it is. It's a lens. It's a perspective. It's not actual reality, right? Like
I appreciate that. See, that's why talking to somebody like you with the kind of Renaissance man range of knowledge base that you have, we could have that kind of flowing conversation. And I would have to say that I am really deeply in agreement with you, because what we're talking about maybe it's not reality per se, because reality is all of those things at the same time going together.
Precisely.
It's more of an analytical, you know what I mean, division.
Exactly.
But I think you're right that it is a perspectival thing. You have first person perspective, second person perspective, third person perspective. So thank you for that clarification
No,
and
no
nuance.
problem. I just think it's important because, like you said, language is so important, right? And it's
Yeah,
oftentimes the language we use and how we characterize, different
yeah,
aspects of reality that lead people, right, to gain a greater understanding of the world around them. And just as a
right.
teacher, is doing this work all the time, I just know that some people might have heard that and been a little bit uncomfortable with
Yeah,
it.
I
So,
appreciate that. I deeply appreciate that. So hopefully, if anyone's nervous systems got caught up, they're able to exhale and relax. The question is, will you continue racializing yourself? That's why that first person is important. Will you continue to view other people through a racial lens? That's the question. Because when you're talking about systems and structures, that is so big that most of us don't live there. Most of us, we could talk about them, but we can't impact change at that level for the most part. So, where can we impact change? In me and in the way I talk to and think about and consider other people. That's the question. So, yeah, not only can we talk about it, we can ask each other and go through inquiry like that. So, I'd have that person to please think about what I just said.
yeah, well said. People need to figure out within their own selves why those feelings are arising, why those fears are arising. Think about it, Greg. You and I, would we ever try to use somebody's racial identity as a weapon against them, or like, their lack of right?
No.
And so, like, you and I know that, right? And but we also know, right, that people will use our racialization against us, right?
Yeah.
People will
Yeah.
use our racialization against us. Does
Yeah.
that make us afraid to talk about race? Does that,
No.
yeah. And we have no fear whatsoever that knowing that there's this external, huge external force that could come down upon us by doing the work that we're doing, we feel no fear. But these people feel fear at some external force coming to them and attributing racism to them, even though they acknowledge for themselves, like, I'm not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I don't this that. So what is the
Well,
origin
see,
of that fear?
yeah, that's a deep one. That's some deep, you know, psychological and psychosomatic, psycho-emotional stuff.
That's a big
And
part of the mythology. That's a big part of the mythology
yes,
of
I
white
do
supremacy.
agree. And you know something, man? This is why the first person perspective is important, because you got to deal with yourself. Yeah, that's why I said we need to have all of the dimensions at the same time. Conservatives usually focus on the first person, the personal responsibility. Liberals and Democrats, progressive, they focus on the systemic, the third person. I focus on that second person. That's where culture lives. That's my particular focus. I'm kind of toggling, and I can understand all those perspectives. But yeah, people need to deal with their own stuff, and it's not easy because when you look within, and this is not just in regards to race, as we get older and we look back at our lives and we say, "Oh my God, I used to think that. I said and did that. Oh my God." So we're talking about a level of introspection and self-reflection uh, that allows us to mature and hopefully grow wiser. But these things don't happen overnight. And there's some tough stuff that we have to go through. Talking about Sheena Mason, I just had a call with her and Carlos and a gentleman named Michael Mascolo, who came to that conference and who has been grappling with and writing. He's a scholar and he's been dealing with these issues and he's trying to come to terms with it. And one of the things she's mentioned at that meeting, and she's mentioned this publicly, she said when she started going through this learning to get to where she is now, it was difficult. She was in tears because at one point she was a social constructionist. And then when she saw that from her perspective, that it's not race that's socially constructed, it's racism. And that there's a strong correlation between racism and race and the very belief in race. And, so she had to go through different stages of her evolution. That's a journey that most of us will have to take, but again, let's take it larger than race. It could be about religion. If you were brought up in a particular religion, when you get to a stage of critical thinking and you start to hear some countervailing perspectives on religion, generally, your religion specifically, you look at the history of your religion and not just what's espoused, but what has actually been done in the name of religion. You know what I mean? So what I'm saying is what we're talking about, this process extends beyond race, but we're focusing through race. But we're talking about being able to deal with oneself in a way that you look at yourself and you ask yourself very tough questions. And a lot of people don't look within. That's why so many people are in therapy, because they need a therapist to help them go through that process, So it's not
Absolutely.
easy.
Yeah. And I would go one step further than say it's not easy, right? But that like humans don't often do the thing that is harder, right? If they're faced with two choices, there's an easy and a hard choice.
Was that they apply Occam's razor in a wrong way?
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. But like,
You
yeah,
know?
yeah, basically, right? Is that like when faced with the two paths, right? Like not all of us choose the path less traveled, the thorny path.
Yeah, I would say most of us don't. That's why I go back to what I said before: a critical mass, a tipping point. One of the things, there was a time, I think, this may have been at the conference. I think Sheena said, we don't need everybody, just 50%. I was like, oh, we don't even need 50%.
I agree. I don't think that we need 50%. I just
When
think
you
whatever
go,
percent we need, we're like nowhere remotely close to it. So like that's where I'm at.
that's the basis of your skepticism. Yeah, but you got to start somewhere, man. You got to start somewhere,
Listen, I have
and then,
hope. I have hope. Even as a
okay,
skeptic, I still have plenty of hope, brother. All right, that's
okay,
why I'm doing what
got
I'm
you.
doing. So
I hear you, but you got to start somewhere, and I think there are some pioneers and some innovators, social entrepreneurial innovators among us, who are willing to start the conversation, wage the battle, so that maybe my daughter's generation. She was at that conference, by the way, my daughter Kaya. So was my wife Jewel. So that maybe her children, you know what I mean? I'm almost 60, man. I'll be 60 in July. So I'm under no illusions that we're going to be able to do this in short time. And I got to say this, the sense of urgency I feel, one thing is Glenn Larry is like, why deracialization now? Like, why the urgency? And I said, one, that was the title that the folks at Free Black Thought created. And oftentimes as writers, you don't create the title, but I was fine with the title. But why? Because we have a series of intersecting crises. It's called in some circles a meta crisis or polycrisis. And the climate is a big one. The environment, that's a big one, there are many problems on a very large scale. In
I call it
fact,
the cataclysm myself.
oh, okay. Yeah, the cup. So for me, I feel the time is short. And the thing is, this is a recent perspective, because I'm generally an upbeat, even optimistic kind of guy. But I started reading certain data. I was like, oh,
And
we
because I'm
need
a
to
math person, Greg, right? So like the only way anyone can ever make a prediction is using math. I don't know if a lot of people realize that, but like it's the only way you can predict anything.
okay.
So I've made a lot of predictions in my life. So I've seen this what you're talking about right now is researching that data, realizing what you were doing is realizing the future, and like there's an inevitability to the future that you're talking about right now, and it's So it could be hard for an optimist like yourself, I guess, to accept. I wonder.
I had to become what I call a tragic optimist, which is my man Stanley Crouch. He used that term, and so did the gentleman who wrote Man and oh good Lord. He was Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. Tragic optimism, tragic. So there's a tragic dimension to life and reality. But at the same time, you want to be able to embrace a hopefulness and optimism. You know, I know they're not the same thing, but I'm combining them so that though you realize that the data may say that this is, oh my God, the thing is human choice. Human choice is still, and human will and human agency is still with us. And we still have time to straighten out the ship. Some people say we don't have the time. So
Yeah,
for
I actually
me,
still agree with you. Yeah, I fully agree with you that like we could turn the ship around at any time that we choose. But the question is, what are we going to choose? So
it's like one of the things they say in politics, well, yeah, you know, it's possible. We have the resources, but we don't have the political will, you know? And that's true. So do we have the will to actually take action on it? And I'm hoping we do. And all I'm trying to do is do what I can while I'm living to put my own imprint on these things that are important to our future as human beings, our future as Americans. I'm trying to, help present and give people options. What I'm not trying to do is proselytize. I mean, I feel very strongly and passionately about these things, but because of my own experience as a born again Christian, as a teenager, I'm not trying to convert nobody.
yeah, I tell people all the time. People are always like, people are always like, well, if you really want to convince someone X, Y, and Z, I'm like, that's not what I'm doing. Like I'm not trying to, I'm not even trying to argue with you. I want to have a conversation, just like you
Right.
and I are having right now, Greg. Right? Like, I mean, yeah, there's gonna be conflicts that arise within conversations. There's gonna be friction points and whatnot. However, like if you don't come out of it believing the same thing that I believe, I don't feel like it's a failure, right? Like, because my
Right.
intention was not to have you come out believing the same thing that I believe.
Exactly.
A lot of people never have the opportunity to think about this stuff. I
That's
talked
true,
to a
man.
woman who wasn't even taught what human feelings were, like literally, who was
Really?
right, like in terms of like grew up in a household, a racialized white woman, grew up in a household where they did not talk about feelings, but not just like that people were having them, but like that they existed. And so she was experiencing, obviously being a human, she would have feelings, and but she didn't know what to do with them or even how to communicate about them. And kind of one thing that really shocked her out of that was living in an all black neighborhood at the time of the assassination of Dr. King. And she saw the grief of the community around her, and that level of grief that you can. I don't know if you watch any like, and probably not, but like I'm a huge anime person, right? So in anime,
I have watched anime. I have
there
watched
is
some.
this trope that comes up in anime where like the main character is learning about their powers and they need to make a power jump, right? And
Okay.
so, for instance, in one anime, Hunter x Hunter, like this energy is pushed through their bodies from the outside, and then it activates their own internal system that was already laying dormant there, and that activation allows them to then continue to grow. And like I think that that's a really good way of kind of thinking about, to a certain extent, what a teacher does in general, right? We're not putting knowledge into your mind. We're making connections with things that you already have within yourself. And we're just drawing lines for you, And then you take that.
Pointing in certain directions,
Right, exactly.
developing your innate propensities and capacities that just need to be drawn out. Education means to educare, draw out. So you're drawing out stuff that's already there. So you are totally right. I totally agree with you, man. That is deep. That is so deep. Lisa Feldman Barrett is someone who's an expert on emotion. She talks about the constructed theory of emotions. uh, and she's, she's kind of, the idea that there is a certain number of emotions, we can name them and you can tell them by your facial expression. She's saying that's some bunk. But it is so sad to hear that there's someone who, I think everybody needs to have some training and some exposure to what's called emotional intelligence. Oh my goodness.
But that's not something that's valued in American society in general. Like, right? Like, I wouldn't even say, I would say neither men nor women nor other, as you said. Like, I don't think anyone is encouraged to show emotion, to learn about emotion, that emotional intelligence is something that's valued. Those things are not like present in our society. Like,
that's true.
so
Not to the extent it should be. I mean, and that's why, see, we're in a period where the information that is available, that's why the foundation of a better and stronger educational system is so important, and is so lacking in this country. Because if we can give people, if we have an education system that's not just based on preparing people for certain jobs that might not even exist in 5 or 10 years because of the vast technological changes, if we had an educational system that helped people develop their innate capacities, that focused on giving them the cognitive skills, the emotional skills, to develop certain cultural and moral capacities, not through indoctrination, but through letting them draw out of themselves what's already there, through working together, through working on projects, through, sports is one way you can learn about teamwork, winning and losing. There's different things, So if you have a better educational system, then you can equip people to then explore on their own, because learning is a lifelong thing, lifelong learning, right? And so then people can then explore on their own because the information is there. Like you talk about, people not being taught, true. But if you have an interest, you can find out about emotional intelligence. You can learn about all kind of stuff. It's there. It's just a question of how do you guide people and give them a foundation of knowledge and understanding that will then give them the platform or a leverage point from which they can then go into that lifelong learning. It must be a multi-pronged approach simultaneously. Some people will emphasize one over the other. Rhetorically, I'm going to say them all. First person, second person, third person perspective. Subjective, intersubjective, objective. We need all of them. You know what I mean? Because you never know what combination of attacking the problem then works together. And then hopefully you have a bifurcation point where there's a change, a phase shift.
I call it a critical point, taking from my chemistry learning.
Hello.
Yeah.
There
So
you go.
one thing I love about this conversation, Greg, is that we've thought about the same things, but like in slightly different ways. And I love sharing our different perspectives on these similar ideas. And it really feels like I found an ally in you in terms of the work that we're doing. And that really gives me even more hope for the future, brother. And it breeds in me a sense of optimism. So thank you.
I appreciate it, Will. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate the audience who shared, and I think people can feel where we're coming from. I mean, people can feel it and hear. It's not just in the words we're saying, it's the way we're saying it and the intention that infuses our words. So hopefully people will then be able to, go on their own paths and try to do, as good as they can and learn as much as they can also.